should be better. Okay? Good. So everybody, I assume, because you are usually the people that are here, everybody's got their second term presentation picked. So it's the people that aren't here, don't have them. Makes sense. So we're going to do Walter Benjamin, and I'm sorry, I'm reading the same copy that you read, so I'd be on the same pages, but I'm sorry that it's small print and not a very good reproduction. I meant to correct that, because I'm stuck with the same thing, so I'm like, didn't correct it. Critique of Violence, it's in a collection of Walter Benjamin's works, Reflections. Critique of Violence was written in 1921. The trajectory it picks up is from Sorel. Okay, so, thanks. So sometimes the way the course is structured, it goes goes Sorel, Benjamin. What I wanted to put in between so you could get Schmidt's idea, which we did last week of friend enemy, and Amin Césaire's idea of violence and post-colonial struggle, particularly post-colonial struggle, but also the violence, the structural violence of European countries. So I wanted those to kind of come before the Benjamins. We're going to pick up violence again, specifically, and we're going to pick up on Sorel. So Benjamin is a profoundly interesting thinker. I find his most interesting work is what's called the Arcades Project. And the Arcades Project it's a series of what he calls convolutes, observations on 1930s and 40s culture in Paris. And it's a really thick book, it's about this thick. So if you get a chance at some point, read it. It's really good. It's really good theory and popular culture at the time, and quite usable. So Benjamin, 1892 to 1940, he's a German Jew. I think I have to put my glasses on to read this because it's just not. He's a German Jew, worked as a literary critic. Let me go over here. Worked as a literary critic, sociologist, philosopher, radio broadcaster, translator, and essayist. He made significant contributions to aesthetic theory and Western Marxism. He wrote The Critique of Violence, which is what you've read, in 1921, and he died by suicide to avoid falling into Nazi hands after the Germans seized France in World War II. So he fled to the Catalonia border, where he was detained, and he ended his captivity with an overdose of morphine tablets. And then this goes on to talk about the Critique of Violence, but I just wanted to give you a bit of bio on Benjamin. Violence and force in German, Gewalt, come from the same word. So you remember with Sorel, what Sorel sees as force is the violence of the state, the violence of the police, the violence of the military. Benjamin's going to carry that forward, and he's going to see that as law-maintaining violence. Benjamin also talks about revolutionary violence, proletarian violence, and he sees that as the violence of the people. So both of them come from the term Gewalt, and they have different meanings in terms of violence, which actually Sorel set out, and Benjamin follows that. His analysis of violence reflects the crisis in European bourgeois liberal democracy. 1921, so 1921, Weimar Republic. Remember I showed the Constitution when we were looking at Schmidt? One of the things about the Weimar Republic was it had about 50 political parties, obviously some larger than others. So you had a very vibrant liberal democracy, albeit a bourgeois liberal democracy. And so his analysis of violence reflects this crisis that's happening in European democracy at the time. and the crisis in the concept of droit, or right. The crisis also in the concept of legal right. That democracy is founded on. So you've got a crisis in the concept of democracy and a crisis in the concept of legal right that it's founded on. The concept of violence belongs then, to go to Lacan, to the symbolic order. And it belongs, when you're looking at force, what Sorel calls force, the concept of violence as force belongs to the symbolic order of law, politics, morality. It's a product of history. This becomes important when we get to the contemporary understanding of violence by Zizek. Somebody told me that Zizek and Jordan Peterson are going to have a debate. Have you heard that? You have heard that. Okay. That's kind of awesome. Have you heard Zizek speak? Yeah, me too. Zizek, it's going to be great because he's not going to stop talking. And you know, anything he says is usually pretty intelligent. So that's kind of cool. Do you know when it is?
No, I'm not sure.
Yeah, me either. So I think it was a grad student who told me they're going to protest it and then go to it. Like, okay, that works, because I want to see Zizek. So Benjamin's really concerned then about, so let me just back up for a second. Because the concept of violence is used by the state, and also the response violence belongs to the symbolic order of law, politics, and morality, it's a product of history. And it's also then, which Benjamin doesn't talk so much about, he doesn't identify it as embedded structural violence. Zizek's going to talk about the embedded structural violence that we never overtly see until something flares up. And Zizek's going to talk about it as the violence of the regime itself, as the violence of the state itself, the subtle violence, the non-obvious violence that's always there. Benjamin, as he's setting this out in 1921, is really concerned about not separating the means of violence from the end. He says, if you separate the means of violence used to reach an end, then you're just going to be limited to the application of violence. And he wants to not just look at the application of violence, but he wants to judge the violence itself. So he's doing a moral analysis of violence. He starts off then, he talks about the natural law tradition. And in natural law, violent means are just if natural ends are just. Violence is considered a natural product according to natural law. Then he moves to positive law. And when he's talking about positive law, I don't know if you've taken courses on, constitutional law or legal theory. At one time I used to teach a third-year class on issues in Canadian constitutional law, which was pretty interesting. And I did it for quite a while, and then I think we hired a constitutional law expert, so I moved on to something else. But I actually enjoyed teaching it because I learned a lot. So, and so I don't know if you've taken courses on constitutional law or not. H.L. Hart is one of the big people, has been sort of defined the concept of positive law. So positive law just defines the means in order to guarantee the justness of the ends. So positive law, Benjamin would say, is really about justifying the means, so that when you get to the ends, these are just. And we can break that down, because he's saying, look, positive law has been constructed in a way that it basically is a justification for the ends. So he retains then the historicity of law from positive law. That is, that it's grounded in history, that it reflects the social order at the time. But he criticizes both, particularly positive law, but also natural law as violent, although he concentrates primarily on positive law. And he says there's a real contradiction. And it's a contradiction that Sorel is addressing as well. It's a contradiction that Amin Césaire that addresses. And that is that on the one hand, individual violence is condemned by European law. It's condemned because it poses a threat to the judicial order. On the other hand, positive law monopolizes violence. So individual violence is condemned, but the violence of the state, which Sorrell calls force, is facilitated. But the law, for Benjamin, the law monopolizes violence. The law is founded in violence and it's a justification for violence. And then he poses an interesting question, and it's kind of true. He says, very early on in the essay, why are we fascinated by the figure of the great criminal? And here he has in mind bank robbers, those kind of criminals. Great criminals who do crimes against property, not crimes against other humans. So he says, why are we fascinated by the great criminal? Somebody who gets away with going against the system. And he answers it by saying, because the criminal, in defying the law, exposes it. Lays bare, exposes the violence of the legal system. So he's thinking there of like political criminals, for example. He's thinking of crimes against property. He's thinking of, I guess, what you could call a moral criminal, maybe, a respectable criminal. He doesn't make that distinction, but I think we probably need to. So we're fascinated by the figure of the great criminal because the criminal, in defying the law, exposes the violence of the legal system itself, is Benjamin's argument. And of course, it's 1921 in Germany when he's writing this, and he's seeing a lot of political opposition being termed criminal at points. Now, there are two kinds of violence for Benjamin, and then he's going to add two additional ones. There's two kinds of violence. The first is what he calls founding violence. It's the violence that founds a regime. It's law-making violence. It's, it's the law that sets up a regime and then justifies it. So founding violence or law-making violence, it founds the regime and it institutionalizes it. And then the second type of violence is what he calls law-preserving violence. That is law that's going to conserve the regime, that's going to maintain the law as it is. It's going to maintain the regime. It's going to make sure that a new founding violence doesn't overthrow it. Here he's thinking of both the police and he's thinking of militarism. So it's violence that's used as a means to the ends of the state. Law-preserving violence is violence of the state, violence that the state uses to stay in power, usually through their military and what Sorrell calls force. So, I'm not sure in Argentina right now, but maybe you can tell me, what's the military backing right now? Are they still backing the president, or are they backing the new?
Oh, you mean Venezuela?
That's what I meant to say. Yeah, sorry. In Venezuela, are they who's the military backing at this point?
I think they're still with Maduro.
Eh?
I think they're still with Maduro, but there's apparently so many officers or whatever, but they don't all have the same kind of leverage, I guess. So some are going towards the new guy, but I think for the most part
They're still staying. Yeah. That's interesting because once the military splits, it's interesting what you said there in terms of the military splitting. Once the military splits and it becomes kind of a free-for-all in terms of individual military officers deciding who they follow, right? And probably the regime's going to go down. If the military is solidly backing one person, probably they're going to stay in power, right? You've got an interesting situation in Venezuela because you've got the international community backing the self-appointed president until elections. Yeah, go ahead. Because I was going to say, it really, Benjamin's kind of useful in terms of looking at this. Yeah, Ibrahim.
Sorry, just to go back to what you were saying, but is isn't Russia and China back in the current dictators, so doesn't it balance it out a little bit?
Yeah, it does balance it out a little bit. And everybody's being really careful not to step too hard, right? So because it balances it out. It's interesting too because, you're right, it's interesting too because what you've got is this fight for founding violence that international communities on both sides are taking part in a country that has had their infrastructure really almost decimated by poverty, basically. So you've got that kind of going on, but you can see, I mean, you can apply Benjamin to it quite well. And in fact, you could apply Benjamin's analysis to Egypt as well, right? So I think he's like really useful there. It gets actually more interesting and more complicated when you've got the international communities ideologically supporting two different leaders, right? And it's also interesting that Russia and China are together on this one. So next time you hear news on it, think of Benjamin. Think of Benjamin's two kinds of violence. Because, I mean, these, you know, the founding violence or law-making violence, when a regime changes, when you found a new regime or you found a significantly different regime, it's not just when there are elections. That's why Venezuela works very well for this, right? Because it's not just about elections. And so you found the regime and you institutionalize it. And then law-preserving violence is you try to hang on to the regime you founded by any means possible in many cases. You try to maintain it by use of military force for the ends of the state and also by the use of police. Benjamin says that the two forms of violence you find coming together in the death penalty and in the police. And on page 243, and you think, okay, the death penalty I get. Why the police? Because the police can take the law into their own hands, he's arguing. So on this very small print you've got here, if you go down to the bottom of the first paragraph, what he says is, and though the police may in particulars appear the same everywhere, it cannot finally be denied that in absolute monarchy, where they represent the power of a ruler, in which legislative and executive supremacy are united, their spirit is less devastating than in democracies, where they take this into their own hands. So he argues that both the executive and legislative function in democracies, the police take into their own hands. So he says then, in democracies where their existence, elevated by no such relation, bears witness to the greatest conceivable degeneration of violence. So he says that in the death penalty and in the police, the separation of lawmaking and law-preserving violence is separated. That the legislative, which is the lawmaking, and the enacting of it, the executive, is separated. Or it should be separated, sorry. In this authority, the separation of lawmaking and law-preserving violence is suspended. That's really a problem. I need to get another run at that, so you probably get it, but what he's saying is that he's not that he's arguing for an absolute monarchy, because he's a socialist, basically, a Marxist, but he's saying that in absolute monarchy, you have the legislative and executive in the same entity. In democracies, they're separate, which is a good thing. And then he kind of jumps and says, but this gets suspended in the police force. Because what he's seeing in 1921, and I'm not going to argue it's the same today, but what he's seeing in 1921 is that the police force is taking into its own hands the idea of like making law on the ground and enacting it. So it's bringing legislative and executive together. We have more checks now on a police force. They're much more answerable in terms of commissions. So in a sense, there's more in a way of preventing this from happening. It still happens. And partly you can see how it happens if, but you can see how it happens if you're in a situation where you feel your life is threatened. Okay, so you make what he would call a legislative decision to do something and then you carry it out. So this distinction is getting suspended. Is that clear, or do you want me to take another run at it, or somebody else wanted to take a run at it? Because he's trying to say there's a real problem in the police force, particularly in 1921 in Germany, in that time period. And that's that they should just be carrying out the law. Okay, but they should just be enacting whatever the legislative law is. But they're also on the ground legislating. Okay? Why is it only me that's having trouble with that? Okay. Because sometimes in some locations it's more like that than in others. Okay? So in a situation where you've got multiple political parties vying for power, in a situation like Venezuela, you'll have the military doing that. You know, opening or trying to like curtail protesters, that kind of stuff, right? If they're just trying to curtail them, they're still within the legislative. They're still enacting the law. If they start taking it into their own hands, once you see where protesters in situations, Egypt could be an example, where protesters and people get shot by the military or the police in a political action, they're acting both as legislative and executive, according to Benjamin. And you could maybe argue against that. You could say, well, they might just be acting in the name of the law, which is to serve and protect, but they are also defining what serve and protect means, I guess. Benjamin suggests the spirit of the police is less devastating, and I read that before, that's 243, when they represent the power of the ruler in which the legislative and executive are united, than in democracies where the two together bear witness to the greatest degeneration of violence. What the state, now the state being law in its greatest force, right? So what the state being law in its greatest force, fears is violence that threatens from within. It fears what we call, to back up, their founding violence. It fears that someone's going to come along, throw a revolution, and found a new regime. It doesn't fear so much violence that transgresses the law. It doesn't fear crime as much as it does founding violence. Which is to say, the state fears violence that's able to legitimate, to found, to transform the relations of law. So a state that's in power, that's already set itself up according to founding violence and lawmaking violence, really fears opposition coming along, overthrowing them and founding a new regime, changing the rule of law, and making sort of new lawmaking, or making new laws and instituting a new form of violence. So think of revolutions. Cuban Revolution is a good example, which we all supported at the time, of course, and for many years afterwards. So you've got the overthrow and the founding of a new regime that has within it founding violence and lawmaking violence that's new. So the old regime fears this. The state fears violence that's able to legitimate, to found, to transform the relations of law. Now, that which threatens law belongs to it. So this is one of the reasons Benjamin says that the state really fears the general strike. So he goes back to Sorel and he says the state doesn't fear the political strike. The state fears the general strike because the general strike is dangerous to the law as it exists. First of all, the law allows it. Secondly, they have to prevent it from going too far. He says they're all revolutionary discourses. And in Germany in the 20s, there were many of these. All revolutionary discourses justify violence by claiming to found a new law, a new regime. He says the founding of all states occurs in a situation we call revolutionary. It inaugurates a new law, and it does so in violence. He's arguing that there's no state founded. So he's really also responding to social contract theory, right? He's saying, look, there's no state founded that isn't founded in violence. Okay, this is the Rousseauian social contract, the Lockean social contract come together, consent, all of that. Once you've made law, it's founding violence. Now you need law in order to function. But he's also, I think, putting in brackets here, or putting under scrutiny social contracts, and putting under scrutiny the discussion of like social contracts that are like, social compacts of people coming together, that he's saying yes, and these are a form of founding violence. Lawmaking and founding violence. And he's doing it in a very short piece. Now, founding violence is mythic. The myth the regimes are founded on. So, think of the myths of the, I'm trying to think of these because I forgot them, but think of the myths that Canada's founded on, like two nations, nobody here before, coming together, war, like that kind of stuff. This is all mythic violence that the regime is founded on. Founding violence is mythic. You have to come up with a myth that's going to hold the regime together. Whether it's an ideological myth, whether it is, what other kind of myth could be? Whether it's a myth where you trace back and you talk about the prehistory and how it gave rise to this history. That's all connected with founding violence. Annihilating violence, though, is divine. And Zizek talks about annihilating violence. Annihilating violence basically today is when you can't take it anymore, okay? When you can't take it anymore and spontaneous eruption breaks out and there's no leaders. So I don't know what's going on with the Yellow Jackets in France. They seem to have located their eruptions for the weekends, which makes me think they're probably working during the week. But what seems to be is that I could be wrong, but where you hear about like something major going on, and mass protests and mass action is on the weekends, they're connected through Twitter, and I think some people have emerged as sort of leaders, but there's no solid leader. There's one person that they at one point had pinpointed as a leader. Partly this is so the violence of the state can't pinpoint who the leaders are too, right? Yeah.
Just to clarify, by myth he doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. He means that it's this like accepted story that everybody agrees to.
Yes, yeah. So it's like the myth, So Cuba's one I know because I did work on Cuba, but the whole idea of like, Papa Fidel, like all of that, him coming in, like, the whole thing of he and Che Guevara being under the water with like reeds so they didn't get caught when they were doing sabotage and stuff like that. That all goes into the founding myth. Okay? So I mean, if you think of like, we can think of any example where people can like founding myths happen with political parties too, and it's a new political party. Where you really see it, then is in revolutionary struggle. So, one of the things like, Mozambique fell apart because it didn't really have a chance, but there was a whole, Samora Machel, when he came in, there was a whole sort of, it's usually tied with the first sort of revolutionary leaders, and there's a myth connected there. If it's an old society, then you get this myth that kind of is like founded in, I was thinking of Athens, in gods. So, like if you read the myth on Athens and how it was formed, that can be part of the myth too. What's the myth of UK? I don't know. I'm sure they have one. But he's saying that, okay, so where he's sitting also, take a look at the myths that were growing up around the Nazis. And if you aren't aware of them, take a look at Lena Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, okay? Because it's on YouTube. So that will show you the whole mythic nature that the Nazis were using in relation to power, and they were also using myth coming in and structures coming from ancient Greece and other ancient societies. And of course, the way she shot it, in such a way that they could never live up to their myth, which is kind of interesting, right? So I mean, it's kind of interesting to look at it now when it's not a propaganda piece, but it kind of exposes what they could not do for, you know, and thank goodness. But that falls right into what Benjamin's talking about. So, you know, in terms of founding violence, you have to find something wrong with what's in existence. If there's no, and now there's no places where there's nothing, so-called nothing there. But in original founding myths, it's like they discovered it. Think of the Columbus founding myth, right? There's one of the most objectionable ones, you know, in the sense that, you know, to the point where Columbus statues are coming down, and rightfully so. But you know, the founding new nations are not taking into account that there were people there before. Okay, that's all part of the founding myth, which then allows you to found your control on. So colonialism had a lot of founding myths. Good on that, or any comments, questions? Like, you know, you think of like what the justification for, we talked about it when we were talking about Cesare, but think of the justification for colonialism and even post-colonialism. You could even say that, you know, economic stability and forwarding of democracy somehow go into founding myths in terms of neo-colonial ties. So annihilating violence then is divine. So to go back to that, it's very interesting because it's not so planned. It's spontaneous, it comes up because people can't take it anymore. And then Benjamin says, and it's the divine that is sovereign. In a sense, the divine is outside law. Because it has just exploded. When it then gets taken into the myth, it becomes part of it. But there's these moments of divine violence. And Zizek really picks up on that because we see more and more, in a way, or at least we're more and more aware of, this sort of explosion by populations that just can't take it anymore because it's so oppressive. And there's moments of divine violence, and then they get channeled into, you know, sort of a mythic nature. But what he's saying is where the hope for something is in this divine violence. Benjamin's concerned with violence that's a product of history. By that he means violence that's brought into positive law and that's maintained by positive law. When he takes a look, he talks about the strike. He says, look, only organized labor and the state are entitled to exercise violence. And what's violence, and he goes back to Sorel, and he says, what's violent about the strike is non-action. The non-action of a strike is not a violent act, but this taking away of a service is seen as violence. The right to strike, which was fought hard for, constitutes the right to use violence in attaining ends. That's on page 239. So if you just want to go to 239, I'll see if there's anything. Yeah, it's towards the bottom there. The moment, so it's about the last 10 lines. The moment of violence, however, is necessarily introduced in the form of extortion into such an omission. Maybe that's not it. The right to strike in the view of labor. Understood in this way, the right to strike constitute in the view of labor, which is opposed to that of a state, the right to use force in attaining certain ends. That's where I wanted to take you. That's at the bottom of 239. So both the state and organized labor have the right to use, they legally have the right to use violence. So if you go back to what Schmidt was talking about, and remember Schmidt said the state is the only entity that can require someone to give up their life for a war. Well, what Benjamin's saying is, and he's read Schmidt, what Benjamin is saying is that organized labor and the state have the right to use violence to get their, have the legal right, he's not saying it's good, have the legal right to use violence to attain their ends. The right to strike is guaranteed workers who are, besides the state, the only legal subject guaranteed a right to violence. Now, strike is a non-violent withdrawal of violence of the, back up and say that again. he considers a strike the nonviolent withdrawal from the violence of the employer. So the right to strike holds the threat of violence. A strike itself, in most cases, if it doesn't turn into a general strike that then turns into a revolution, is a nonviolent withdrawal from the violence of the employer. So the state grants the right to strike, and this is very close to Sorel, which contradicts its interests, because the right to strike forestalls violent actions the state is afraid to oppose. So the right to strike then prevents direct actions of sabotage. And he's thinking there of burning the factory, burning parliament buildings. Yeah, just hang on a second. The state and labor refrain from violence due to the fear of mutual disadvantage. So it's like a threat to each other. Yeah, Carmen.
I was just gonna ask if you would consider like a strike, an organized strike that got to organize for like founding violence in some way.
Well, it's law-threatening violence. So, I mean, it's tricky. If they got into power, yes. Okay, if they were able to change, okay, I think I know where you're going on this. If the right to strike, if they exercise the right to strike, which is a legal right, and in the exercise, so that's within like the founding laws that exist, right? And if within that, they were able to change the laws on labor, then that could be a form of founding a new law.
Would you consider that like favorable or not?
Benjamin would consider that favorable. I mean, Benjamin's coming down along the same lines as Sorel. Where he'd probably go with Sorel is if by chance after that the labor leaders become very strong in the parliament and get co-opted, then there would be the violence of the sort of state taking them in. The real problem is labor and the state are not really separate, right? Particularly now, so we've got like tripartite divisions. So labor and the state work within the maintaining law to keep strikes from causing too much damage. Okay? So, what Benjamin would say is when you strike, it's a nonviolent action, you're withdrawing a service from the violence of the state. However, you say, okay, well, what about like the strike last year? Okay, it was withdrawal of service. You can't really see the university all that much as a sort of a violent state actor, other than, I guess you can see it, if you were Benjamin, you would see this strike as attempting to not maintain the poverty level wages that TAs are getting, which they are poverty, particularly in Toronto. And also the fact, I mean, part of that too is, I don't know what education costs now, but it's pretty expensive. So I mean, most people, I don't have to tell you this, but most people are working and going to school. So I mean, if partly you would want free education. Not even ideally, it should be a right. If you want to have a learned population, and you want to have, you do want to have free education. So if you look at Germany, for example, there is free education. So one of my colleagues did his PhD in Germany because it was free, okay? And which is kind of pretty amazing. So it allows people that can't afford to do it. I mean, he got accepted into, I think, Cambridge or something, right? But he couldn't afford to go. So that's a violence. Zizek would say that's actually a violence of a regime. That's embedded in a violence of the regime itself. So then you could see an educational workers strike against something like that as a strike against the violence of. I don't have to tell you this because you know this, right, Carmen? But against, I'm sure you guys all know it too, but against the regime as it exists. Yeah, Greg.
So the only valid violence would be like a strike, like a revolution would not be considered valid.
Can you say that again? Just a bit
The only
louder.
valid violence would be that of a strike, like a strike.
See, he's getting, it's like, okay, so he's got two valid violences, right? And in terms of, one would be the strike that a labor union uses to make demands. which is what Sorrell sees as a proletarian general strike, right? And then, as Carmen is asking, if that goes far enough, you may get new laws. So it could be a new founding moment of violence, founding law. And it ends with divine violence. Divine violence, of course, is a hope that this not being able to take it will go to something else. So the rising up, this like outburst of spontaneous violence where populations, Zizek looks at one in France where populations can't take not having buses coming. They can't take not having like water. The suburbs where not having electricity, the suburbs where the population is not treated the same as other citizens. Big outburst of violence, burning cars and that, just to have the same rights as other citizens.
So basically the law destroying violence is
Yes, law destroying violence is valid, providing it's not just based on overthrowing the law so you can come into power. Okay, because then you could say, okay, well that's just what the Nazis did, right? The Nazis really did have the law. They changed the law. They suspended, using Article 41. They used it, suspended it, and then took the law right into their own hands. So that he would see as like extreme form of executive and legislature coming together, an attempt to found a new violence and founding a new violence for a period of time. But he wouldn't be in favor of that by any means because he died trying to get away from that. What's interesting is he was at the Catalonia border with Arthur Koestler. Do you know the writer Arthur Koestler? Darkness at Noon. It's a book on Stalin. It's actually, really, he's done some really good stuff. He's also done a book called Call Girls on academic conferences, which is kind of cool. It's just like he's a real sort of left social critic. He and Benjamin were on the border together. They took the same amount of morphine, and Benjamin died. He didn't. And it was really sad. When Benjamin died because they opened the border the next day. So it's just like I just got goosebumps on that. It was just like one of those like terrible historical incidences, and which also means, hey, systems process drugs differently. Based on size, based on metabolic rate, all that kind of stuff, right? So it's really unfortunate because Benjamin is out of what became the Frankfurt School. Benjamin's by far one of the most profound thinkers and one of the most poetic thinkers. And one of the most political thinkers, yeah. Yeah, Carmen.
I just have a hard difficulty understanding what he's seeing as legitimate violence versus not, because
That's easy.
well, okay, because
It's easy until you think about it too hard. It's easy because, look, for Benjamin, non-legitimate violence is the founding and maintaining violence of the state. It's the very same trajectory as Sorrell. It's what Sorrell calls force. Legitimate violence is, again, a general strike that could become a proletarian revolution that's going to change the system as it exists, and then you get into the problem. When you start founding a new system, it's a new form of founding violence. And once it solidifies, you could still have the similar problems.
Then what's his end? What does he see as a legitimate revolution? What's the end of violence then?
Okay, so Benjamin ends. I'll come back. I'm going to go back to this because I said it before. He ends with the understanding of divine violence. Okay, I don't think he's a programmatic thinker where he says, it's not that he's saying, okay, we're calling for a revolution to overthrow and then found a new regime. He's trying to warn people that in every founding of a new regime, what you end up doing is founding a violence and maintaining it. Okay, so he's providing a critique, but he's not programmatic in saying, okay, this is where we're going.
So is it a little nihilistic then, that you're just never going to get out of it? Because what's the point of going through a whole violent revolution if you think that's just going to recreate?
Well, it is going to recreate a founding law and a maintaining law structure. That's not to say it could not be a whole lot better than the previous one. Okay, so that would be one thing. Secondly, okay, he's both Marxist and influenced by Nietzsche. Okay, so you're not wrong in terms of, and divine violence then, you know, it's the same old thing. And you see it happening again and again and again. You particularly saw it happening in Africa. During the struggle, okay, so during struggles for independence, there was an incredible amount of hope. Once that's solidified, and that's also, you know, where women were integrated into the struggle, quite in non-traditional female, so-called female roles. And then once the regime is founded, you've got, in order to function, you set up a law, right? You set up socialist law, which is fine. You set up like a way of maintaining it. You set all this up, and then you've got embargoes and mercenary killers coming in from countries and assassinating. Was one of the problems that happened with both in Southern Africa, right? In terms of revolutions. You also have people once they're in power, like Mugabe, who doesn't want to go. You know, like all of a sudden they start reaping all the. I mean, he was a very strong revolutionary leader until he got into power. So Benjamin, in a way, and until he stayed in power forever. So Benjamin, in a way, is kind of warning us about this. But I don't think he's, and I mean, I would stress again, as we all know, some regimes of founding violence and maintaining violence are much better than others. You know, so not to say that everything's the same. He's saying that this, in terms of structure, it is the same there. Okay, so we did the one behind. To go back then to a revolutionary general strike, one of the things, and Benjamin's, you know, he's not a politician, he's not a political writer. He's like a social, he's providing a social critique. Sorel was much more politically located in terms of what he was writing about. Benjamin is saying, you know, he's saying, okay, this is what he's observed in terms of violence and violence of regimes. Now, it's a very famous piece that then gets picked up by a number of people, including Fanon, but including Derrida does Deconstruction of the Law based on Benjamin. It also then gets picked up by Zizek. So it carries through. Again, sort of like Schmidt, and your question's like really good, but sort of like Schmidt, it's a very basic and simple idea. And so if you get a basic and simple idea that's going to carry through, it will be used again and again, right? So the friend-enemy really is a simple idea in terms of the political, as is the 4 different kinds of violence that Benjamin sets out. So a revolutionary general strike discloses the violence that's there both in the state and in labor. Labor appeals to its right to strike, and then the state will call this appeal an abuse because the right to strike isn't a revolutionary act, supposedly. And then when it starts, what Benjamin observed is that the state takes emergency measures. So you've got the right to strike on legally there. Often when strikes happen, particularly if it becomes a general strike, the state is then going to take emergency measures enacted by the military and the police. These are all, that's a drawing of Benjamin. So the Proletarian general strike, partly the fear of it, and this goes also back to Sorel, is that it takes the right to strike to its limit, and the state can't stand the limit. So what it then does often is declare the general strike illegal. Now, if you're in Germany at the time he was writing, the state declared political parties illegal. So you can sort of see the maintaining violence of the law when it's taken to its extreme. So violence is the exercise of right, and he says, right is the exercise of violent. Droit is the exercise of violent. So violence is the exercise of right, and right, with something that's given as a right, is also the exercise of violence. He's saying you can't separate the law and violence. Violence is not exterior to the order of right. It threatens from within. So what the state fears is this violence that threatens from within. That is, the violence, to go back to Carmen's question, the violence that could potentially be another founding violence. It's not violence that transgresses the law, as I said before, which happens in crime. It's this violence that could potentially be another founding violence. Violence is also a means. And he says all violence as a means is either law-making or law-preserving. If it lays claims to neither of these, this is on 243, it forfeits all its validity. So all violence as a means is implicated in the nature of law itself. So if you go to 243, 243 is a page that has a lot of his ideas on violence on it. Last paragraph there, beginning. All violence as a means is either law-making or law-preserving. If it lays claims to neither of these predicates, it forfeits all validity. It follows, however, that all violence as a means, even in our most favorable case, is implicated in the problematic nature of law itself. You can't separate law and violence. He says that we're obliged to, and if you continue down further in terms of contract, he says that we're obliged to note a legal contract, this is at the bottom of 243, confers on both parties the right to take recourse to violence in some form against the other. That could be a social contract when you enter society, but you give up your right to violence. But if it's a legal contract between people, both parties have the right to recourse to violence in some form against the other, should the agreement be broken. Which allows Benjamin then to say, the origin of every contract is a violent origin. The origin, very bottom of the page. The origin of every contract also points towards violence. It need not be directly present in it as law-making violence, but is represented insofar as the power that guarantees the legal contract is in turn of violent origin, even if violence is not introduced into the contract itself. That is to say, that there's a latent presence of violence in every legal institution for Benjamin. When this disappears, the institution falls into decay. So he uses the example of the Parliament of his time, in 1920s. He says they haven't remained conscious of the fact that what they owe their existence as a liberal democratic institution to is revolutionary forces. And he's referring here to Germany after World War I. He says that the parliaments lack the sense that law-making violence is represented by themselves. So once they feel that once they come to power, they no longer are enacting violence. They fought to get to power, but once they come to power, they don't see the law-making and law-maintaining acts as violent. They lack the sense that law-making violence is represented by themselves. But what Parliament achieves in vital affairs can only be those legal decrees that in their origins and outcomes are attended by violence. He says on 244 that non-violent resolution of conflict is possible at the private levels. So if you go to the second paragraph there on 244, is any non-violent resolution of conflict possible? He says, without a doubt, among private persons are examples of this. Non-violent agreement is possible wherever a civilized outlook allows the use of unalloyed means of agreement. So alloyed is a substance that's a mixture of two or more metals. Unalloyed is pure. He draws then on Sorel's characterization. Yeah, we're doing fine. He draws on Sorel's characterization of the two types of strikes, political and proletarian. He emphasizes that the two are antithetical in their relation to violence. So if you take a look, you've seen this quote before, Benjamin quotes it. He quotes it out of Reflections on Violence, out of Sorel's. He says, and I'll read it off here, He says, the political general strike demonstrates how the state will lose none of its strength, how power is transferred from the privileged to the privileged, how the mass of producers would change their masters. In contrast, the proletarian general strike sets itself the sole task of destroying state power. The first political general strike, the political general strike is law-making. The second proletarian general strike is law-breaking and anarchistic. And then, if it sets up new laws, it becomes law-making. He sees it, he's also a dialectical thinker. So he sees it as a circle happening. Now, if you can't exclude violence in principle as a solution to problems, Benjamin says the question then becomes, are there kinds of violence other than those envisioned by legal theory? And this is where it goes back to mythical violence. So he says in mythical violence, what you get is an outburst of anger by the gods that challenges fate. It's immediate. It's a mythical manifestation of violence. And it's closely related to law-making violence. So mythical violence is an outburst that then goes into law-making violence. It's that archetypical is an outburst of anger by the gods that challenges fate. It's immediate. Its mythical manifestation of violence are closely related, is identical to law-making violence, and then he's going to get to divine violence. But first, he's going to talk about the function of violence in making law. The one that's not so clearly set out for him is probably the most important one, which is divine. So the function of violence in lawmaking is twofold. Lawmaking uses violence as a means to pursue. So lawmaking, I know it's hot in here. Are you guys okay, or are you really hot? Okay? Okay. So lawmaking uses violence as a means to pursue its end of what it wants to be established as law. And then when the law is established, violence doesn't go away. It can't. Because the end you've created is bound to violence. It becomes power. So when the law is established, violence is not dismissed. It can't be. The end is bound to violence. Benjamin says under the title of power. So lawmaking is power making. That's to say that the end law is established by violent means and maintained by violent means. And mythic violence is that which you feed into it. Does that make sense or no? Anything on that? Thomas, you good? Yeah, okay. Power, then, so lawmaking is power making. The end law is established by violent means and maintained by violent means. Power is concerned with the means. Then he talks about justice in what we would call the broad sense. And justice in the broad sense is the principle of all divine end making. Power, he says, is the principle of mythical lawmaking. He says that the very act of destruction involved in mythical violence, which is lawmaking violence, poses a question of a pure, immediate violence that might be able to call to a halt mythical violence. This is divine violence. So he's saying that what can halt mythical violence is divine. Divine violence is the antithesis. Now this is on page 250, but let me go through this first and then we'll go to 250. It's the bottom of the first paragraph on 250. But let's go through this first. So justice is concerned with ends, power is concerned with means. Justice is the principle of all divine end making. Power, the principle of all mythical law making. And then This is probably one of Benjamin's most famous quotes. He says, if mythic violence is lawmaking, divine violence is law destroying. If the former sets boundaries, the latter, divine violence, destroys them. If mythic violence brings at once guilt and retribution, divine power only expiates. If the former threatens, the latter strikes. If the former is bloody, the latter is lethal without spilling blood, although it can spill blood. So that's from on page 249 to 50 in the reading. Benjamin smoked a lot, because it was in the 20s. So, Benjamin says, on page 4, on slide 14 here, Benjamin says that what you see in operation is a historical dialectic. So this is where you get the sort of dialectical thinker and the circular, right? Which will take you in a way back to Hegel. He says that you see a historical dialectic of law-making violence, law-preserving violence, the overthrow of law-making violence, the founding of a new law, only to begin the process anew. So he would say that's what drives history. And he's not wrong, okay? I mean, it's a simplistic version, but because it's a simplistic version, it fits the situations. So he's saying that what you've got is this historical dialectic of law-making violence, which is based on a mythical foundation. And then, once you've made the violence, you are preserving it. Then you're terrified as a state that you're going to be overthrown. Then you get the overthrow of law-making violence. You get the founding of a new law, and then the process begins anew and continues. It's really funny. I guess this room really needs to be clean. Like everything I sit on or touch is sticky. Darn. So founding law, and maybe this will help for what Carmen was asking. Founding law doesn't recognize existing law. Okay? Because in the moment it founds another. So if you're fighting against existing law, you're not recognizing it. In the moment, it founds another. And on the other hand, because it can't be justified by any pre-existing law, it appears savage. And on the other hand, it's more difficult to criticize the founding moment of violence because you can't summon up a pre-existing law. So if you are fighting against a regime, you are not recognizing the founding law of that regime or the maintaining law. However, because there's no existing law, unless you're a labor union that says you can do this, it appears that you are engaged as savages. Okay? Very interesting when you get to Fanon and the London Proletarian, right? On the other hand, it's more difficult to criticize the founding moment of violence because you don't have a pre-existing law from which you can do this. You've got an old law that's been overthrown. So it takes a while before you can criticize the regime. Think of like the founding of new states. What's the most recent founding of a new state? I mean, we've got India 47, we've got the Cuban Revolution in 59. We had Mozambique in the late 60s, Tanzania, Zimbabwe. They're all kind of late 60s. No, actually 73 for some of those. Because I was in Portugal when people were coming in from Mozambique and Zimbabwe, the colonial officials, right? Okay, anything?
South Sudan.
Kosovo and South Sudan.
Nice. Okay, Kosovo is 1990 something?
Kosovo was like 2007 or something.
Seriously? Okay. Did something happen in Kosovo in 1990s or no? Or am I just
That was Bosnia.
I think I'm collapsing it with Bosnia. Okay. Kosovo 2000, you said 7?
Something.
And the second one, South Sudan? That's very,
2011 maybe.
I was gonna say, that's very contemporary. So, do you know anything about the South Sudan? Who's in power now? Okay, I'll take a look and see. Because I don't know. Okay, those are contemporary. Egypt Revolution, 2011, but then it gets overturned and back to, that's very interesting. You can almost directly apply law maintaining. You can founding violence, then losing of founding violence, refounding violence. You can call it sort of refounding violence, the military refounding. So there's a moment there where you've got like a new regime and then it closes up again. 2011, anything post 2011? Iran is interesting, okay? Because Iran, there's many people on the ground there and externally that are not buying into the maintaining law. There's many student protests and also women's protests, but they never seem to get to, it gets to a certain point. So the laws, partly because of the force of the state. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Carmen, yeah.
I just wanted to ask some about, like, in regards to Egypt and flying Benjamin.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't, I feel like they're potentially, like, it started out as annihilating violence, right?
Yes.
Because it was an eruption, it wasn't like an organized thing where, like, there was like textile workers going on strike, but it was like this, like, divine sort of like
Moment, yes, where people came together and there was also the use of, very strong use of technology there.
Right, yeah, it was. But then I would potentially argue that that's why it ended in such, in the desperation that it did. Because if there was some sort of organized attempt at grabbing power, then yeah, you could say it was founding violence that ended up better, right? Like in this way where you see some sort of development, right, of some sort.
Okay.
But then, that's why I struggle sometimes with this, like, because I don't know if he's saying that annihilating violence is better.
No, you gotta get rid of the better.
Okay, not better maybe, but like, he
So-
seems to.
So let's go back to Egypt for a bit, okay, and take a look at that just for a second. So what you've got is a real coming together, sort of a spontaneous and technologically led coming together with also, as you pointed out, the textile workers on the ground and the students, all sort of coming together in not being able to take it anymore, wanting changes, right? So in a sense of divine moment, and you've got like the, you've got the Western media all there, you've got this divine moment. Then you've got the groups that worked very hard in the local areas that were setting up structures, okay, on the ground. And there's this moment where you think that they're going to be empowered. I'm trying to remember what the name of those the groups were. They were really awesome. It was the Brotherhood. They were awesome depending who you read, okay?
Well, yeah.
Or at least they weren't the military.
They weren't the military, but then, and like, yes, military, but then you had like, they would keep like Morsi when he got in, even though it was like a popular vote, he was not actually super liked by most people once he was in power.
Okay, nailed it. That's good. Once he was in power, because all of a sudden he's stuck with, it's like almost like when anyone comes into power, they're not going to be super liked because they're stuck with all the dregs of the regime, and they have to start implementing law-maintaining violence against their own population, and that's what he did.
Yeah, but the Muslim Brotherhood, like a lot of people who were like on the ground grassroots organizing, like saw them as coming in and co-opting the movement anyway. And if the grassroots kind of like, organizers, in my opinion, would have had certain structures in place.
Nice.
To actually like, and it was more of an organized attempt at like, still you have to like obviously like sort of direct the range that exists, right? That's obviously gonna take advantage of the moment. Then you might have seen, I think, potentially. I mean, the military might have still like stepped in at that point. I mean, that's still a possibility, but
Yeah.
there was
I think
more of a possibility with the Muslim Brotherhood to happen.
There was what?
Like, it gave the military more legitimacy because of the lack of popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood in general.
That's interesting. Okay. I mean, listen, I hear what you're saying, and I don't have any disagreements with that at all. And it makes perfect sense. And so I just want to break it down in terms of Benjamin's model, okay? Abraham.
Yeah, so also Morsi, like the reason he started getting hated in Egypt is because usually democratically elected positions in government, he started just appointing people, right?
Yeah.
So he'd start changing things up on the inside.
That's a really, that becomes a really important observation because he took both legislative and executive together, right? That's, yeah. Okay, good. So what you see, I think where Egypt might fit with this is that this it happens it almost happens anywhere. Once you come into power, you're going to lose favor in more degrees because of things you do, but the things you do are around, the founding moment, founding new law, and maintaining it. And once you start maintaining it, those who object to you, you end up bringing the force of the state against them in some way. So that's where Benjamin could sort of work there. And then, to go what Carmen said, what you want to do then is break the other details down sort of inside of this, right? Because his model is not intricate enough to kind of do that. So when you want to do it and want to apply the sort of dialectic of this in a historical and geolocation, then you would break it down inside of that. And I think that could work quite well, as you were showing. So it's this historical dialectic of lawmaking, law preserving. I think this is really interesting. So it kind of, it goes lawmaking, law preserving, the overthrow of lawmaking violence, the founding of a new law, and the process begins again. And founding law, I already did that one. Founding law doesn't recognize existing law at the moment it comes in, and there's nothing to make way for it. So it's sort of outside until it founds, and then it becomes maintaining law. So to break the cycle, so he takes a look at like breaking the cycle. And he says we're doing good. To break the cycle maintained by mythical forms, what you need is divine violence. And divine violence, and as Carmen's pointing out, divine violence can go, the moment that it ceases to be divine violence, it can get swallowed up into something else. So it's a very good, if you've read Rosa Luxemburg, it's very good, spontaneous, but once it gets solidified, then it gets taken up by law-making violence. So to break the cycle maintained by mythical forms, divine violence is necessary. It's violence that's outside of the law. Once it gets recognized, okay, so once divine violence gets recognized, it becomes mythical. And Benjamin says on 252 that when it becomes mythical, it bastardizes pure divine violence with the law. So, if there's one takeaway on this, Benjamin really sees the law as being violent, which is why this piece is really fun to teach to people that are doing legal studies. So, once divine violence gets recognized, it then becomes mythical, which then is going to bastardize the pure divine violence with the law. So then, all mythical lawmaking violence, which we may call executive, is destructive. You can also call that lawmaking, you can call legislative as well. Destructive, too, is the law-preserving administrative violence that serves it. So he's saying that basically this mythical lawmaking violence, which is legislative and executive, is destructive, and the law-preserving, which administers the violence, is also destructive. And that's on page 252. So that's at the very end. And it's just towards the, he says, but all mythic lawmaking violence, is the very last sentence actually, last two sentences, which we may call executive, is pernicious, destructive, wicked. Pernicious, too, is the law-preserving administrative violence that it serves. So I would add there that the lawmaking violence, which we may call legislative and executive. He kind of collapsed his terms. Human justice, then, is embedded in the mythic violence that founds law. And he says that when he says human justice, he's using it here in the narrower sense. Human justice is embedded in mythic violence that founds law. That is, what is just is what the law says is just. Divine violence destroys law. So he's making that real sort of, and then when it reinstates another law, it feeds into mythic violence. which allows him to say, divine violence may be called sovereign violence, 252. That's his very last sentence. Divine violence, which is a sign and seal, but never the means of sacred dispatch, may be called sovereign violence. Now, what he means, I think, by that is that divine violence is violence undertaken by sovereign individuals. It's a strike at power. It's an attempt at the dissolution of the law in favor of justice, just for all. It's a decision, then, that one makes individually and as a group, as actors. It's a decision that reaffirms the sovereignty of the self and the collective according to a concept of justice that is much bigger than the justice that's enacted by law. So it's a decision that affirms the sovereignty of the self against the violence of the law. Now you would say, that's interesting. Benjamin wrote this in 1921. Would he have written the same today? I mean, that's always a question you can ask of a theorist. I don't know. I mean, maybe. I think it works. I think it works as a large dialectic that then you place sort of historical occurrences inside and have them work out inside of it. Maybe it works because it's so broad. I think what Zizek does with it, which is done in 2005 or something, works because he sees the very violence of the system. He makes this claim, and it's a great claim. We don't actually see the violence of the system until it's not working. Okay, so the day-to-day embedded violence of any system that's there in the law, we don't actually notice. Okay, it's only when there's this, when the system starts, or when people can no longer take what the system's doing to it, and there's a divine outburst that we actually notice it. And then, as a collective, often what happens, unless we're aware, is that you end up blaming the people who have engaged in the divine violence. That's where Zizek takes it. So, I mean, we can talk in seminar about whether it works or not. Just before we end, it's almost 1 o'clock, which is good time. Any comments or questions on this? Yes?
So,
Miriam.
He's in favor of anarchism, is what you're getting at.
That's interesting too, because he sees divine violence as sovereign and anarchistic. Okay? Benjamin's tricky. I think if you want to take the trajectories that go in there, you'd have to say, like Sorel, anarchism does feed into it, but he's also a Marxist social critic. So Marxism feeds into his understanding. He's using a Marxian dialectic, and he's putting in historical detail of his time. He's also, I would say, influenced by Nietzsche. And think back to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and think of what Nietzsche does with sort of the divine eruption, right? So I think he's influenced by that too. I'd say those were the three sort of threads that are most obvious. He's also, in a way, influenced by a thinker who kept his work. Okay, so I don't know if you've heard of Georges Bataille. Bataille used to be on the course in terms of the structure of fascism and expenditure. He's one of my favorite thinkers. So when Benjamin was leaving Paris, he left all his writings, particularly the unpublished writings, which then came out as the Arcades Project with Bataille. Because as well as being a writer, Bataille also had a job at a library. And so he stored them in the archives, which is how they still existed. And what you see here in terms of sovereign, I would maintain that it draws on Bataille's understanding of sovereignty, which also is traced through Nietzsche, okay? And Hegel, in a way. But so the sovereign there is that which isn't co-opted into a system. The sovereign act, it may just be expenditure, okay? I mean, for Bataille, the sovereign act is expenditure. It's, in a sense, you do something, but it doesn't have an outcome. And I think that's where he got sovereign from. So I would also link that there.
I just think when we sort of bring up anarchism, it sort of clarifies it sort of clarifies this violence, like the different kinds of violence.
And that's interesting.
why, okay, we're trying to keep it at a certain level where there isn't some system that comes above and imposes a law.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, okay, now that may be my take on Benjamin. I'm not sure that's what he's saying. I'm not sure he's saying we want to keep it there, but he definitely does not have, he's not a programmatic thinker, which means he doesn't have, he's not a Marxian thinker, which is like, you overthrow the state, he would say, like Sorel, you know, once you've seen the overthrow of the state, you've got the phase of a dictatorship of the proletariat, they get solidified, start making new laws and maintaining laws that never goes away. So certainly anarchist in that sense, yes. And he doesn't have a program. So he's a critic. He's an essayist and critic and literary theory, yeah. Yeah, that's good. Anybody else on that? Yeah, round the table.
Question, what is Benjamin trying to illustrate when he brings up the commandments and tries to contrast them with law?
Okay, so he's saying that I would say, and that's a good question. So he's using the commandments that once, okay, so you're given the law from, I'm going to say, he's using the Jewish God, so you're given the commandments which then get put onto the tablet and written down as law, okay? So you've got this divine moment where you get them. And then once they're encoded, you end up having to follow the commandments which are encoded, so that's maintaining. And then, so he's really talking there, and then you get the whole myth. I mean, you get, I don't know if he says this about the myth, but you get the myth of how they were given to Moses, right? So you've got like all of that going on, and then he traces another Greek myth in there as well, right? Niobe. But so he's kind of just saying, okay, the religious, what you see happening in the official maintaining text of the law in Judeo-Christian religion is parallel in a sense to what happens in terms of the law maintaining violence of the state. Yeah.
But one thing when I was reading that, I'm not sure if I misread it or whatever.
Probably not.
But I believe he talks about like the idea of the divine and God not being judgmental, whereas the law is.
Brilliant. You didn't misread it at all. Yes.
So, like, there's a distinction, but I don't know what the significance is, like, in terms of the rest of the text.
Just what you said. I mean, you summed it up really well. So God being the divine is not judgmental. So in terms of divine violence, it's not contained within a system. Okay? The second part of what you said, which is when it is encoded on, it's encoded and becomes a law that's given to the people, that then has a different, that's myth and law founding and law maintaining violence. Yeah, that's great. I always find it interesting when people go, I don't know if I understand, and then they usually nail it. So that was great. Anybody else? Okay, let's take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and do the 3 presentations. So what time is it right now? 1 o'clock? Okay, so 1 o'clock? So be back at 1:15.